Today, we're going to talk about America's relations with Africa. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you that I'm dedicating my talk today to a wonderful friend, Sheila Johnson. She passed away recently, and I'll always remember her because when she was a little girl, she was living in Holland, and they were starving because the German occupation had taken all the food away. So she and her mother spent the day and the next day and the next digging up tulips, and they ate the tulips. And now whenever I see tulips, or when I go to Holland, to Kukendorf, the huge gardens there, and see miles and miles of tulips, I always think of Sheila. She was a wonderful friend, as was her husband, Chalmers Johnson. And the reason I got published was because of the two of them. She was a great editor. She actually wrote, as a Dutch woman living in Berkeley and getting a PhD there, she wrote a column for a Japanese newspaper, a daily column. So she was smart, and she will be greatly missed by her friends and by me. And then I have another announcement to make now that one of my people who work with me has just come in. The film committee is desperate for people to be projectionists. And the friend is right there, and he is doing the projections. And here is Renata, who is actually begging on the street. Come right in, Renata.
Thank you.
For a person to be a projectionist, there's no work involved at all. You just have to learn to push the button that turns on the film, for heaven's sakes. But we do need projectionists in our community who will help out with the Thursday night. Now, soon, in a couple of months at least, certainly Comcast can only be so slow that they will hook us up so we can have movies every night in your own apartment, and you won't have to come down to the friendship room. And I don't know when that will be. They make promises and they don't keep them. But sooner or later, we will. But until that time, if there's any of you who'd like to volunteer, what do you get for volunteering? You get a front row seat for you and your husband or best friend, and you get to see the movie. And they're really great movies. So anyway, if you would like to do that, we would very much like to encourage you to join us. You could talk to me afterwards or talk to Renata afterwards. Also, not only am I dedicating this lecture today to Sheila Johnson, my great friend, who spent the last years of World War II digging up her garden to eat the tulips because the people in Holland were starving to death. So I don't know if you've eaten the raw tulips, but they're not very good. They're gorgeous to look at. You can find me out on that if you go to Keukenhall. But when you're really hungry, I guess anything tastes good. And I don't think we will have tulips for dinner, so you can avoid it. But they might be as good as what we get for dinner. I heard who's laughing over there. Okay, I've told you who I dedicated this to, and then I've told you we need projectionists. And now I'm going to remind you again that you should not have a cell phone with you. If you do, make sure it's off. That's OFF, so that we don't have the delicate ring of a phone going off. What we're going to talk about today is, I think might have sent a few of you not to choose to come, is Africa, called by the people like us, the dark continent. And one of the reasons it was dark was because of us. Africa is a big country. Noel Coward once wrote a play about China, and he said, China is a big place. Well, it is a big country, but Africa is a big continent. When I fly there, I usually fly from San Francisco to Dulles Airport in Washington, and then I change to South African Airlines. And then I fly across the Atlantic, stopping in the old French colony of Senegal in Dakar to refuel, to make sure we'll make it all the way to Johannesburg. And then we stay on for another little lump, and we're in Cape Town. Wonderful, wonderful place. So we'll start with the tip, Cape Town. What's it like? Well, it's unbelievably wonderful. They have a huge national park called Kruger. They have to cull the park every so often. Culling means you have to kill some of the animals so the rest of the animals can live. So that's a sad day, particularly when it comes to the elephants. But Kruger is a great park. Pretoria is a beautiful city. Joburg is a city of great sadness because it's associated with apartheid and the big camps that were there that were like internment camps in some ways for Black people. And so when you think about it, the place to go to get the sense of the sadness is Robben Island. Robben Island is right off the coast of South Africa, right outside of Cape Town, just a little boat ride away. And it's where many of the great leaders that were to be spent a lot of time. One of those is the great hero, Mandela. And you can go to Robben Island now and you can see his prison cell. He was finally put in a movie, but obviously he didn't play himself. So they hired Morgan Freeman. It's probably the best film that Freeman ever made. And it's certainly true that Morgan Freeman probably did a better job playing Mandela than Mandela could himself. So it was that these people struggled down. Why is it so difficult to get one group to rule and the other group to live with it? Well, it's because it's fabulously wealthy. One of the things that Cape Town actually was as a settlement, not British, it was Dutch. But the Dutch fought a war with the British over this, called the Boer War. You might have heard of it. And in the Boer War, people like Winston Churchill, a very young man, he fought in that war on the wrong side, but he fought in the war. The Boers lost, the British won. But there were so many Boers. A Boer is a naturalized Dutchman who lives in South Africa, that in no time they were ruling the country. They gave Britain some of its best leaders. I don't know if you know that there was a man in Britain who in World War II taught the British how to bomb the Nazis into rubble piles. He was known as Bomber Harris. He was South African. He came to the aid of the British when they needed him. And in that sense, there was a struggle. The struggle was immense because, number one, the colony, Cape Town, had been settled by not the British, not even the Dutch, but it had first been a watering place, a place where you stop to get fresh water on the way to India. So you have the Portuguese there, Vasco da Gama. And then you have the onward movement. And then later, the British decided that they wanted to move some people in. The British are always great for screwing things up. Sorry, Robert. So they brought in a lot of Indians, Hindus. So if you know something about Mahatma Gandhi, you know that he grew up in South Africa and then was part of the great diaspora of Indians from Hindu India who were citizens. And if you saw the film when I showed it, Gandhi, you see him as a beginning as a man before he becomes a Mahatma, living and trying to make a way in British South Africa. But what happens is that the group of people who are there, whether they are remainders of the Dutch, even remainders of some Portuguese, they did not want to turn South Africa over to the Africans. So they established a system called apartheid. And the apartheid regime was very ugly, like most racially based regimes are. And that's why Mandela spent a creative part of his life on Robben Island as a cellmate in that terrible, terrible place. It's, I guess maybe you could think about it if you ever have a hankering to go out on a nice day to Alcatraz. Alcatraz is no longer a prison, so you can go there. I know that some of my friends actually spent a lot of money so that they could spend a night in one of the prison areas at Alcatraz. The last thing I'd want to do, but you know, wealthy people in San Francisco are bored easily. And so they go off and spend a night sleeping on a broken down bed in Alcatraz. It's not a place I don't think you'd want to go, Robben Island. So we went through a long struggle, and the people who made it worse were us. And the person who could do something terrible was the most famously famous American president, Ronald Reagan. Everyone I knew at Berkeley who ever met Reagan as president always said, he is such a nice guy. You really actually get to like him when you meet him. Well, he might have been nice, but he was also really dumb. And the most dumb thing he did was anything to do with foreign policy. And so he decided that the apartheid regime was a good thing. And so we have this American gesture toward this white supremacist group who are ruling over these multitudes of Africans living in terrible places like Soweto, which aren't death camps, but they were close to it. So we move out of that period of darkness. Now, South Africa isn't all there is to Africa. When I go to Africa, I usually fly from San Francisco to Dulles, and from Dulles I change into a South African plane and fly on to Dakar in French Equatorial Africa, and then take a refuel, and then we go on down to Joburg or Johannesburg. But there's much more to Africa than that. First, Africa is a really big country, continent. And the north of Africa was easily settled by the French. We're talking Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, the Italians in Libya, and then the French and British in Egypt, and that took care of North Africa. But there's all of the rest of Africa. This area that was called for years the Belgian Congo, because it was a large Belgian colony, which was terribly misgoverned by the king of the Belgians. And in no time at all, it broke up into many pieces. It wasn't called the Belgian Congo any longer. It's called Zaire. And we had a wonderful United Nations leader who was killed in that breakup. Many people blamed the American CIA for his death. As a country, Zaire split into many parts. The part that was rich was Katanga. Why was it rich? The same reason that many people went to Africa in the beginning. They went for the gold and for the diamonds. The famous diamond mines in South Africa, but diamonds were found elsewhere. There is a place in Africa that is my favorite to go to. It's called Botswana. It's huge. And what's wonderful about it is it has more animals than it has people. So when you get there, you find it unbelievable. There could be so many animals living in one place. And it has a great river run through it, and the river turns into a delta, the Okavango Delta. In the Okavango, where I've gone many times, you come to areas of huge pans. A pan in Africa means a huge amount of water, water being critical, because Botswana is also the home of the Kalahari Desert, a very inhospitable place. But between the animals and the diamonds, there was much to rip off and take away. In the case of the Okavango, it was a river that turned into an inland delta and gave you huge herds of elephants, lots of single and family groups of rhinos, huge amounts of crocodiles, if you're interested in crocodiles, some rather dangerous snakes, black mambas, one bite and you're dead. Another snake that I also hated, I hate snakes, was a cobra. There was a little furry animal that also hated snakes and hated cobras. It's a mongoose. And they would surround the snake and catch it when it was not looking and kill it, and then eat it. Good eating, I'm told. Everybody I know who's ever eaten snake tells me it tastes just like chicken. But we get enough chicken here at Piedmont Gardens that I don't have to go buy any snake meat. So you can find whatever you want. In the case of Katanga, you found that the trade in diamonds became very nasty. They're called blood diamonds. They use children to find them and to bring them out, all illegally. De Beers is the big company. It's in London, and it's like a cartel. It buys all the diamonds that are found, gets them to the point where they can be cut. In Africa, for a very long time, you could get diamonds cut there because there were a large number of Jews involved in the diamond business. And until they left South Africa in particular and went to Israel, it was one of their big businesses. The other group that also cut and polished diamonds were the Hindus from India, and they took the trade back with them. But still, there are a large number of very big stones found, cut, polished, and sold. Most of those things that you ooh and ah at when you go to London to see the crown jewels are stones from Africa. There are no odd diamonds lying around Sheffield or Birmingham. They're often called the Star of Africa, this and that and the other. Big, chunky diamonds, the kind that you can put in a tiara. time, the kind that looked very, very good on not so much Elizabeth, the Queen, but looked wonderful on Princess Diana. And she would borrow a tiara or two for a special occasion before her tragic death. So you find these things around, and let me tell you about the whole settlement process. The settlement of Africa by Europeans is a 19th century phenomenon. For the British, they had a dream of running colonies all the way from the north, and they called it from Cairo to Cape Town. The French had a dream. It went east-west from Dakar in Senegal to Djibouti, with a D, to Djibouti. And they ran across each other, east, west, north, south. And the French decided to step back. There's a very famous incident, the Fashoda incident, where Britain and France were at loggerheads. But France had discovered she had a new enemy. Kaiser Wilhelm's New Germany. And so in order to have peace with England, when she knew she'd soon have war with Germany, she stepped back and let the British have their way at Fashoda. And the British were very good at their exploration of Africa. One famous name is Livingstone. Dr. Livingstone was lost for a while in Africa. It was he and others like him who found the source of the Nile River. The Nile has two sources. One is called the Blue Nile, and one is called the White Nile. And they rise in the heavy mountainous areas in Central Africa or in Ethiopia. And they have Livingstone, all to the good, found that there is a wonderful area in Africa that has a falls. So of course, what do? The English are not very innovative for names, so they named it Victoria Falls. So the falls that are really spectacular to see in Zimbabwe are there. Another phenomenon that happens with Africa is the fact that for the Americans, we are peculiar people at best. And we have the famous great white hunter phenomenon. Even one of your presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, went off to Africa to shoot big game. And he came back with trophies, elephants. But the man who made it fashionable is a very big star in television this week. His name is Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway wrote 3 great books. The first is the greatest classic in American literature, Farewell to Arms, written when he was in Paris. But his first book was The Sun Also Rises. That was written and published and shown initially to a woman from Oakland, who was very famous for coming from Oakland and moving to live to Paris with her girlfriend and saying of Oakland, there's no there there. And she read the manuscript. She read everyone's manuscript. She saw a talent in Hemingway. He had just married his first wife. He was always marrying another wife. And she helped get him started, along with the others in the lost generation of Paris after World War I. John Dos Passos, and also Fitzgerald. And it was a young man from Malaga in Spain who came up to Paris to paint. And initially, He had a blue period, a rose period, and then he discovered Cubism. And his name is Pablo Picasso. And Picasso's Cubism went directly towards a new phenomenon. Out of Africa had come a huge number of pieces of African art, and they impressed Mr. Picasso, Senor Picasso, and it began to influence his work. And it became an important phenomenon because the art of Africa flooded the markets in Paris. And the colonial types collected it and took it away from Africa, where it was symbolic and very important, back to the home country. Now, to the great credit of the French, particularly their current president, Macron, he has decided that this was a ripoff and it should be returned. And so huge numbers of African art have been packaged up, boxed up, crated up, and shipped back to the African. One people who have not done this, to their great shame, are the British. The British took over Nigeria rather slowly. And one part of Nigeria is called Benin. And Benin is very famous for a series of Benin bronzes, magnificent masks, statues, groups. And they are still in London, not returned, and very much wanted back by the Nigerians. So you have to get a sort of sense of that. First, the horror of the blood diamond, using children to go after the diamonds and smuggle them out. And the idea that a national treasure in art is taken away and not given back to the people it belongs to. And then the whole process of building these colonies. I'll tell you a little story. Half of my family, my father's people, are from Georgia. And my father's people often lived on the sea islands off the coast of Georgia. And on one of those sea islands, these are little tiny islands in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the southeast, there was a group of Africans brought over as slaves. In most cases, you can't trace them because their families are broken into various pieces, and then they're sold and resold. They have no heritage that they can remember, no language that they can remember. But there is one island. And on that island, the people never left. They came as slaves and they stayed. Their families were not broken up. They're the Gullah people. And Gullah is a language very closely related to the Yoruba-speaking people of West Africa. And so by studying them, we can trace back a large part of the African heritage that is dispersed now all across the south of the United States and then all the way to California. But the culture is gone. It was destroyed in slavery, by slavery days. But the Gullah remained as a trace, a human connection back to a people who had lived on the coast of Africa and had been taken mainly by, I think you know this story, I've told it hundreds of times. In 1607, the first British colony in North America was settled at Jamestown. I used to swim in that area with the James River. And within 10 years, a ship showed up. It was a think of Portuguese, but it could have been a Dutch ship. Anyway, it had onboard people to sell. And there was nothing that pertained in law to this. So the law that was used for chattel, that is, if you own that walker and a few other things, it's your chattel, your tables, the things that you own. And so the Virginians used the term chattel to describe humans. They were now chattel that could be sold, and they were sold in the upper South and in the lower South and all over the South into slavery. And that could not be ended until a great and terrible war. Put an end to slavery, but it didn't end the economic side of slavery, which then became sharecropping. So it's no wonder that Martin Luther King ended up saying, "Thank God Almighty, free at last." Because it was a long struggle from Jamestown to the Lincoln Memorial in the Washington area. That takes us a long way away from the Africa that we know today. And one of the images you get out of that Africa is the Great White Hunter. And the Great White Hunter was not only our President Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, the Republican Roosevelt, but also was the people who populated the stories of Hemingway. Those stories moved on to be not just short stories. The great short story of the war was not of the war so much. The greatest mountain in Africa is Kilimanjaro. The greatest animal in Africa is the African elephant, like a great bull elephant. I met one once on a dark and stormy night. We're coming back to our base camp in these modified Jeeps and down a dirt sort of road of some sorts, unpaved, obviously. Suddenly crossing out of the bush was a huge bull elephant who was obviously less than happy at seeing us. And he let it be known, and we just remained very, very quiet. And finally he went away, thank God. And we got to get back to our camp and get quickly into bed and turn off the lights and hope that the elephant was gone away. But Hemingway made a great life out of it. He wrote that wonderful short story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, which was made into a very big film with Susan Hayward, Gregory Peck, and Ava Gardner. And all of Hollywood went crazy on those kinds of films. You might remember a very famous one, which is actually a true story. The Germans were very late to get into the trade of, well, they never got into the slave trade, but certainly getting into the colonies. So they got two colonies out of the rush: German Southwest Africa and an area called Tanganyika. And Tanganyika is the place where John Huston, famous film director, took Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart to make a rather famous film. And in the process of doing that, Huston would go crazy. He'd get as the director, he'd get a word that there was a bull elephant somewhere or a new rhino being sighted, and he'd stop production on the film. I'm sure you know the name of the film. And he'd go off to hunt for this, and so would Bogart. And so there was Hepburn. And Hepburn never got over this. She was a professional. So she wrote a book later after the film was finished, which gained many Oscars. And her book was, quote, How I Went to Africa with Bogart and Bacall and John Huston and Almost Lost My Mind, end quote. So from the African Queen forward, you have Hollywood turning it into great filmmaking and giving you a chance to feel the thrill of it all, because they all went on location. Let me give you another example. When he was young, and actually Clark Gable was very young once, he wasn't always Rhett Buckler telling Scarlett O'Hara, I don't give a damn. And he once made a film called Red Dust. And the reason to see that film was there was a gorgeous platinum blonde in it named Jean Harlow. And then 20 years later, he made the film over again. Gable was good looking when he was young, when he was middle-aged, and when he was old. Like some Irishmen I know. They're good looking forever. And so he went off and made Mogambo with a woman who would be a princess, Grace Kelly, and a woman who was never going to be a princess, Ava Gardner, in a very famous film, again, shot on location in Africa. And Gable is a great white hunter. In this case, it's much more sympathetic if you just capture the animal and then sell it to a zoo rather than shoot it and put the head up. We used to be rather famous at Berkeley for being sympathetic when we weren't sympathetic at all. And the way to prove that you weren't sympathetic to animals was to go to the Men's Faculty Club, which is a wonderful building designed by Mabeck, one of the giants of early 20th century California architecture. It's made out of 100% redwood. The walls are redwood, the floors are redwood, the ceilings are redwood, the furniture is redwood, everything's redwood. It's wonderful. And unfortunately, in those early days, when Berkeley was just a little nobody town, Berkeley wasn't always famous. That's a rumor that's not true. And what did they have hanging on the wall? With all these professors who had gone off and shot something, and they'd had all the heads mounted. And when you came into the Great Hall to have lunch, there you were looking at a rhino, a major horned animal, or looking at a heaven only knows what beast was. And it so upset the generation of the 60s, since we only had one faculty club, that the women organized and founded the Women's Faculty Club at Berkeley. And it was a club you had to belong to in order, so that kept the men out. You had to pay dues. And there wasn't a head in sight, that is, an animal head. And so part of the faculty was happy, the female part, and the men were still sitting there growling underneath the heads of the various animals that had been stuffed and shot. And if you go there today, it's still there. Even in the middle of this pandemic, the animal heads survive. And so the great white hunter became a sort of symbolic view of looking at Africa as a place where people went. From the French point of view, it was a place that they had helped rob, and they're now returning the art. And from the point of view of people like Picasso, it was a great inspiration for art of its time to now move into the modern period and give Picasso a way of looking in the Cubist dimension at the art that came out of Africa. So what else can I tell you about Africa? It's the places I don't know are the Congo Basin. Congo Basin is it's notorious for one famous book. There was a Polish guy, very much like the Polish guy you all might know who lives here with us, Piedmont Gardens. I'll give you a hint. He's known as Dick. And this other Polish guy had amazing talent. He left Poland and went to England. And he became a great, great British novelist. And he wrote several books, all classics within the English literature, British literature. He gave us the greatest classic. It's a great short book called Heart of Darkness. And Hollywood, of course, made it into a movie. The director, Francis Ford Coppola, was able to talk a very, very overweight Marlon Brando in playing Kurtz. Kurtz is a man who's gone off into darkness. He's left civilization and gone up a river. And in that area, he is turned into an animal more than a human. Brando shaved his head. He was perfect Kurtz. And the film was transposed to give you a sense of the tragedy that was our war in Vietnam. So you have the opening. It's a mixed metaphor of many, many dimensions. These helicopters are going to fly in from the ocean side of Vietnam, the Pacific, over the coast at treetops level. And in the meantime, Richard Wagner's famous Flight of the Valkyrie is playing at full blast, frightening the hell out of the villagers who are all going to be killed. Nice little meeting with the Americans. One tragedy on top of the others, Heart of Darkness. It's a brilliant film in many ways. The book itself is marvelous. You get to meet a man who is part of civilization, who drifts back out of civilization into the lack of a civilization, back into madness, because Kurtz is mad. And he's living up country and he's being targeted by the Americans who sent him there. And the American who goes in to get him has one mission: to kill him. So it's not what you call a happy-go-lucky movie by any stretch, nor a great happy novel, but a brilliant one, for sure. And so you get those ripples coming back to the West from the dark continent. You see them in all of their misery. The slaves used to tell a few stories that came through our side of the Atlantic. It was the dreaded Middle Passage. The slaves were crammed into these slave boats, hardly any room to move. And so the disease struck. So you lost maybe a third of your cargo, human cargo, and you threw them overboard. And you always knew, because you could smell a slave ship miles before you could see it. So terrible was it. And then you could also see the sharks, because every day there was another dead person to be thrown overboard, to be devoured by the sharks. The Middle Passage. So it was that these people of Africa, felt the wheel of fortune turn against them. Do you know that one of the reasons North Africans, the Arab world, has very little to do with sub-Saharan Africa? It's because they were slavers before we were. That is, the Arabs came down and took slaves and took them back. As late as the 20th century, as late as your own time, after your own civil war, after we had passed the constitutional amendments so there would never be slavery in our country again, the Saudi Arabians were still taking slaves from Africa. Our ally, the one who recently murdered an American by chopping him up into little pieces in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. It's actually a consulate, since the capital of Turkey is in Ankara, not in Istanbul. So one tragedy to another, is these endless stories of woe. You can imagine seeing a Black man enslaved in the 20th century in Arabia because they were still going across the Indian Ocean to raid in Africa, East Africa. Very funny, because the Asians came, the people that some people are now killing in the streets of America. And they came all the way from, with a huge fleet they built in the harbor of the Yangtze, mouth of the Yangtze at Nanjing, called Nanking in those days. And then they got an admiral to command the fleet. He was actually a Muslim. And they sailed and sailed all the way down the coast of Asia, past Malaysia, past Indonesia, out into the Indian Ocean, and all the way to the coast of Africa. They didn't take any slaves. How foolish of the Chinese not to take slaves. Wasn't part of their culture. Sure was part of ours. They did trade with the Africans, and they were anxious to trade for baby giraffes and baby rhinos and baby hippos and baby elephants, because they wanted to take these exotic animals back to China to put into their zoos, and they did. If you can imagine being on the banks of the Yangtze River as the fleet returns, and what is their cargo? A lot of baby elephants, a lot of baby rhinos. Fill up a zoo. When the ships left the other side, where the Yoruba people lived, those ships were loaded with human beings. So different people at different times had a sense of influence. From Nelson Mandela and his wonderful friend, Bishop Desmond Tutu, who as a Protestant prelate, a religious man who won a Nobel Peace Prize. You have one group of Africans, and they succeeded in getting their freedom. And whether Reagan liked it or not, they put an end to the apartheid regime. The Boers had lost. They're still there. You can see them. It's a wonderful, wonderful country. It's full of vineyards. South African wine is some of the best wine in the world. Beautiful natural parks and beautiful animal parks. Kruger, one of the greatest parks in Africa. Some people's experience, of course, are quite different from others. One was a Danish woman related to Danish nobility. She came, she stayed, and then she left. And she wrote a wonderful book. It starts, I had a farm in Africa. You know her as Meryl Streep, of course, the actress who can play anything. So she's playing this woman who has found her way into Africa, fallen very much in love with them, with the people that she treasured and tried to protect. Of course, you know, Hollywood is not going to be very good if it just has one woman. You have to have some handsome hunk. So they went out back on the back lot and found Robert Redford. So he played the male lead. He was obviously just decoration because Streep acted the whole film through as only she could. But she gave it a sense of this woman, this Danish woman, Isaac Dinesen, her own love of the African people that she was going to live with, what she was involved with finally and is still there to be enjoyed, is that coffee grows extremely well in parts of Africa. And this was one of those parts. So she opens a coffee plantation and sells the coffee. Today, this coffee is highly regarded in the markets of the world. And so you meet various different people, not just Americans and their great white hunters. You meet the Chinese coming and going. Today, the biggest groups in Africa investing are the Chinese. They've built huge road complexes, huge rail complexes. They're the biggest investors today, where once it was the British and the French. Now it's the Chinese outbuying us, outstripping us with investments in this area. You might wonder how others now figure out how to work this. And this, I'll give you a story. Americans never understood what was going on. There's a tiny little former French colony called Gabon, G-A-B-O-N. And every time that they looked like they were going to have a civil war, the French rushed in and rearranged the power equilibrium in their favor. Who hears about Gabon? It's a tiny little nothing of a place. The French care a lot about Gabon. The French have today the most advanced nuclear industry of anybody in the world. The French get 80% of their electric power off the nuclear generating facilities up and down the Rhone Valley. You can't go a mile down the Rhone Valley without seeing one of these telltale signs of a funny looking chimney and smoke coming out, smoke being basically the steam from the generation of power, 80%. And when they're not doing that, The French are not only turning Gabon into a colony again, they are investing heavily in Algeria, that marvelous country in the north of Africa, from which Rosa in our dining area and Anis are people who came. They're now American citizens, but they were once Algerians. And what do the Algerians have that the French want? They gave it up as a colony. De Gaulle said, we're finished with it. And now they're back. Well, they're back now because they invested heavily in natural gas. And they send the natural gas across the Sahara down to the coast, like to Algiers itself, the port city. And then they liquefy it. And then they put it onto various special ships that carry nothing but liquefied gas. And those ships are like a whole cargo group of ships going and coming, going and coming, going and coming, going back empty, picking up full, going, ending in Marseille at a special port built there. In this special port, it is offloaded and then it is put into a gas line that is turned back into natural gas and feeds across a grill, a huge grid that feeds the European natural gas grid. All of it coming into the French port of Marseille, to a particular port that's built specifically for this one thing. So it's either natural gas from Algeria or uranium from Gabon. And that's why there will never be a change of government that's anti-French in Gabon for as long as you live. It's a colony that can't become a non-colony. They pretend they have elections. As long as the government is pro-French, that's fine. What do the French use? The French invented a group of people years ago, the misfits of the world, the people who didn't know what to do with themselves, young men. I can think of thousands of them at the University of California at Berkeley. And they go off. They're looking for adventure. They don't want to study French literature. They want to go out and meet the women of French literature. So what do? They join the French Foreign Legion. Now you think that that's something that disappeared, something that went away somewhere back in the 30s. It did not happen, my friends. The French Foreign Legion was reestablished again after de Gaulle's time. The Legionnaires had been, unfortunately, part of the attempted coup against de Gaulle, so he wasn't very favorably positioned. But the French have a Foreign Legion to this day. And when they say there has to be a change of government in Gabon, it's the French Foreign Legion that shows up in Gabon, suddenly airborne, dropping in to say hello. We don't like what's going on. So Africa still feels this imprint of the outsider. When they're very, very clever at it, they can turn the tables. They like very much Macron, the president, because he's returning their art. They like very much that the French have no problem with Black people. That's amazing when you see what problems Americans have with Black people. So since we have no problems, many Black people go to France. After World War I, a wonderful Black singer. She was the toast of Paris. She decided to stay. She took all of her money, which was a lot. She bought a chateau in France. And in the chateau, she invited in hundreds of French orphans, and she raised them as a gift to the French people who treated her like a human being. I was once in a class at Berkeley, and I heard that we had a Regents Fellow I said, oh, that's good. Who is it? He said, it was James Baldwin. I said, oh, that's terrific. I love his books. And I found out no one was inviting him to their class because they didn't know what he would say or what he might not want to say, or they were afraid of James Baldwin, the famous Berkeley faculty. So I got his cell phone number from the chancellor's office and I called him, and lo and behold, he answered the phone. And I said, Mr. Baldwin, I'm teaching a course and I would love for you to come to my class and teach the whole day. And we'll come pick you up. We'll take you to lunch. He said, no, it's not necessary. I have my own car, but I will come to your classroom. And lo and behold, he did. Now, here was a Black man with a long heritage out of Africa. He was also a gay man and a terrific writer. And so we had this conversation. It was electric. Every secretary in Berkeley who was Black had found a way to have her lunch period moved. And she had come and she brought her own share. It was an electric experience. There was this man, very credible, who was going to talk to us, and he did. So as usual in my class, I usually had a couple of athletes, and this one tall blonde guy from Southern California raised his hand and said, Mr. Baldwin, I am involved in an effort to stop violence against women. And Jim said, well, that's good for you. And he said, but I understand that you have written an article for a Playboy. Was it Playboy? Yeah. And my girlfriend and I, who's here in this class, are opposed to that magazine as a magazine that exploits women. And Baldwin said, well, good for you. You white honkies have been raping Black women for centuries. So I don't give a damn what you think about my $5,000 I made for writing that article. I'd write it again. There was a dead silence in the classroom. What to think? Will there be a fist fight? So I, of course, the meek one, I said, well, you know, Mr. Baldwin, this is all very interesting, and let's move on to another subject. But you have to understand that that comes from a long history. James Baldwin is still one of my favorite writers. His wonderful book, The Storm Next Time. What does that mean? It's biblical. God promised Noah, if you know your Bible, that he would not ever destroy the world again by water, by fire next time. And it turns out that Jimmy told my students he had been a young boy in Harlem, a place I always thought was great. You can go up to Harlem, you go to these wonderful places and dance, hear these Black entertainers on 28th Street. And here he was telling us about it. But he grew up there, having to live in Harlem. And when he grew up, there were two roles for Black African people. You could be a pimp or a pusher. The pimp sold women and the pusher sold drugs. That was your choice. And he didn't like those choices. He was once invited to the White House. There was an Irishman in the White House at the time. You might remember him. It was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And the Kennedys were very excited about this, Robert and John. They were both in the Oval Office when he came, because the important mission, as seen by the Kennedys, was that this was a man, Jimmy Baldwin, who spoke out for integration, for the mixing of the races that had come in slavery and now in freedom. And it was very important that this message get out, because there was another man living in Chicago who was preaching separatism. And he had a very powerful ally in Malcolm X, who had decided to go off and become a Muslim in the middle of nowhere, not understanding that Islam, as he thought he'd heard about it back in Chicago, was a very different religion when you got to Africa and when you got particularly to Arabia. And so Baldwin came, met with the people there. I don't think he was heavily impressed by Jack Kennedy. Obviously, there are other things on Jack's mind. And so the world turned back on itself over and over again. Baldwin wanted to settle in France. And he told me why. And I told him about a great lunch I had. I have a very good friend. Her name is Phyllis Champion. Phyllis is a Black lady. She's a student of mine, a graduate student. She had invited me to come to lunch one day at the Press Club, San Francisco. And I said, all right, sounds great, free lunch. Well, it turns out that there's someone else at the table when I walk in. So I walk up and I'm introduced to Mrs. Eldridge Cleaver. Now, there are many names in Black history in America. Eldridge Cleaver is one of them. And his wife, very smart. She went on to get a graduate degree, I think at Harvard. And we talked, and she told me what it was like. She said, you know, when we fled from this country, and that's what they did, we would go to Cuba, we thought. That's the land of freedom, as opposed to what America stands for. But we got there and found out that the Castro regime was totally white. Black Cubans didn't have a role to play. They didn't interested in Black people. So they decided they would go to Algeria. Big mistake. The Arabs had been raiding Africa for years, centuries, for slaves. So they finally got a clue. And they said, we'll go to France. And they went to France. Mitterrand's government had a problem in that they didn't want to do anything to upset America because Americans were so easily upset. So what to do? So Mitterrand's people met with Eldridge and Mrs. Cleaver and said, you're welcome to stay here as long as you wish, but you may not involve yourself in politics because the Americans are watching. And so they stayed there. And then finally, Eldridge realized they weren't French people. They were American Blacks. And he'd rather go back and face the music. And so they came back. They were wanted. They were on the FBI list. And he paid his dues. It came out. She'd had it. She'd been dragging her children around. She got divorced. Eldridge led a very strange life after that. he became a lawyer. And he took up the strangest cases in Berkeley, which is always strange at the best of times. We'd had a large number of little old ladies, they're sometimes called, women who were widows, who had decided to rent out their house and see if they could live better in a condominium. And several of them had decided they'd rather live in their house, and they came back and they couldn't get in their house because the people who'd moved in would move out. So if you can imagine anything stranger, here is Eldridge Cleaver defending little old white ladies so they can get back in their house when he didn't have a house to live in. Africa, the dark continent. It's come a long way, and my word, I just kept talking and talking and talking, and the time has gone by. I'll let you go. You can think about it. If you have any questions, you can ask me later by coming up here. Otherwise, I'll see you again next week, I hope. Thank you very much for listening.